We said that forensic science is the application of science to criminal justice, but the boundaries are not so firm. The boundaries are actually quite fuzzy, because many of the concepts and ideas of forensic science can also be used in other areas, in other fields. For instance, they can be used in art. The picture on the right is a picture of the playwright William Shakespeare. And for many years it was believed that this particular picture really was a picture of William Shakespeare painted by someone who either knew him or actually was looking at him at the time. And that made it very valuable because it was the only such painting in existence. Then someone did forensic analysis of the paint. They looked at the paint chemistry, they determined what kind of paint it was, and it turned out to be a kind of paint that had first been used in the year 1818, more than 200 years after Shakespeare died. So it turns out that this painting wasn't so special after all, and we still don't know what Shakespeare looked like. Forensic science can also overlap with archaeology. We've said that forensic science can help you reconstruct the events of the past, and of course that is what archaeologists always seek to do. And we will have a case study later on which illustrates this point. Forensic science techniques can also be important in sport. For instance, in major sporting events, there is drug testing for the athletes, and this uses similar techniques that might be used, for instance, in a narcotics case. Forensic science can impinge on international politics. The picture on the right, taken at the site of a mass grave in Bosnia. These poor people here were killed as part of the Bosnian conflict, and the investigators are trying to determine who they were, how they died, and who killed them. In addition, forensic science can come into play during disasters. In the 2004 tsunami that struck Aceh in Indonesia and Thailand and other places in the Indian Ocean, there were so many people killed, so many bodies, that forensic scientists from the region had to be mobilized to help with the identification. Forensic science, however, is not that new. It's roughly 100 years old. And one of the interesting things about forensic science is that it was being done in fiction books before it was actually being done in reality. So on the left, you see the instantly recognizable Sherlock Holmes. And if you read the Sherlock Holmes stories, you'll find a great deal of good forensic science in them. Curiously, Sherlock Holmes was not created by a forensic scientist or a police officer. He was created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who had just qualified as an eye doctor and started writing the stories in order to pass the time while waiting for patients to show up. And he turned out to be much more successful as an author than a medical man. We consider that the real founder of forensic science is this man here, a French professor called Edmond Locard. And here on the slide you see a very substantial quotation which is attributed to Locard. And it really summarizes what forensic science is about. Talking about the criminal, wherever he steps, whatever he touches, whatever he leaves, even unconsciously, will serve as a silent witness against him. Not only his fingerprints or his footprints, but his hair, the fibers from his clothes, the glass he breaks, the tool mark he leaves, the paint he scratches, the blood or semen he deposits or collects. All of these and more bear mute witness against him. This is evidence that does not forget. It is not confused by the excitement of the moment. It is not absent because human witnesses are. It is factual evidence. Physical evidence cannot be wrong. It cannot perjure itself. It cannot be wholly absent. Only human failure to find it, study and understand it can diminish its value. So this is a very powerful quotation. And one of the most important parts of it is that final sentence. When forensic science goes wrong, when innocent people are sent to prison because of forensic science, it's not because the evidence, the physical evidence, the data collected from the evidence is wrong. It's because of the human factor. There is a human error somewhere in the chain which has made that mistake. It's a very valuable quotation, but it's a very long quotation. So it's very helpful just to remember the short form of this quotation: every contact leaves a trace. And of course, when Locard uses the term trace, he's thinking of the traces in his quotation there. Some of them are very difficult to observe. Fingerprints can be very hard to find. Fibers can be almost microscopic. Tool marks can be hard to discern. Blood or semen stains can actually be invisible to the naked eye. So many of these traces to which Locard refers to here are very difficult to find. Sometimes, however, traces can be pretty obvious. Here's a curious case from the Times of London, where a burglar managed to leave his false teeth behind. Now, I have real teeth. I'm no expert on false teeth, but I think you'd notice if you didn't have them in your mouth. Here's another case, and it's a case I like very much because it actually comes from my hometown. My hometown is not the most interesting town in the world, but this is one of the most interesting things that's ever happened there. And it concerns this builder's merchants called Elliot. And round the back in their backyard, they had a big tank of diesel. And somebody would climb over the back wall of the yard, steal some of their diesel. So the manager decided to do something about it, and he put razor wire on top of that back wall. So soon after, when the first employee came in one morning and went round the backyard, he noticed something rather unpleasant on the razor wire, and it was a finger which had been cut off. Now, this was a very easy crime to solve because it's a pretty obvious trace, and all the police had to do was to go round to the local emergency room and ask them if they had anyone there with a finger missing. And the culprit was subsequently arrested and convicted of this crime. The case of the Italian banker Roberto Calvi is a very interesting case. It was forensic science that made it possible, in this case, to distinguish between murder and suicide. Now, Roberto Calvi used to run an Italian bank called the Banco Ambrosiano, based in Milan, and he was nicknamed God's Banker. And the reason for this nickname is because a lot of cash from the Vatican would flow through his bank. Now, there were some strange goings-on within the Banco Ambrosiano, and it culminated with about 1.2 billion US dollars missing. Now, these days we're quite used to banks losing much bigger quantities of money than that. But back in the 1980s, $1.2 billion was a very serious amount of money indeed. So what is known is that Roberto Calvi disappeared from Milan on June the 11th, 1982, and he was found just over a week later in London. He was hanging by his neck from underneath Blackfriars Bridge, which is shown on the right here. And what he had done is to get a false passport, shave off his moustache, adopt a false name, and escape from his problems in Italy to London. Now, to first appearances, it looks like a suicide. Here's a man in a lot of trouble. $1.2 billion is missing. The Italian police want to talk to him. The mafia are involved and they might want to talk to him. And also, in most probability, the Pope is pretty mad at him as well. So clearly it's a man trying to get away from his problems, cannot escape, and so makes the ultimate exit. However, not everyone was convinced, and Roberto Calvi's son was convinced that his father had not committed suicide. Now, an inquest had been held and a verdict of suicide had been returned, but Roberto Calvi's son campaigned so vigorously that the very unusual step of a second inquest was taken. Now let's look at some of the evidence here. What did the police find when they investigated? Well, Roberto Calvi was hanging from the bridge, but he had bricks in his suit pocket. This doesn't make sense. If you're going to hang yourself, you don't need bricks. The weight of your body is sufficient. Bricks is what you'd put in your suit if you're going to drown yourself in the river, which he didn't do. In his wallet, he had a very, very large amount of money in various currencies. If you're going to hang yourself, if you're going to kill yourself, why do you need so much cash? Because after all, you can't take the stuff with you. He had a false passport, so he had the opportunity to travel. And when they checked his hotel in London, they found that his bags had been packed just as if he was going to travel. Let's look at the pathology. His neck was not broken. Well, that is consistent with a hanging, a non-judicial hanging. There were no drugs in his blood. There was no signs of a struggle. The marks around his neck are consistent with hanging. There was no water in his lungs, so he hadn't been drowned. He was wet quite a way up his body, but that is because the River Thames at that point is tidal and the river level goes up and down. His watch, he was wearing a very expensive Philippe Patek watch, and that had stopped at 152, because even though it was expensive, it wasn't waterproof. So this gives an indication of the time when he was hanging from the bridge. A very important point was made by the investigator hired by Calvi's son. At this time, Blackfriars Bridge had been undergoing maintenance and it was surrounded by scaffolding. Calvi was hanging from the scaffolding. This was yellow painted scaffolding. And what the investigator did was to go to the company that had supplied the scaffolding. He got the same scaffolding, he reassembled it, and he got someone to climb up and down that scaffolding. And he found that whenever you climbed up and down that scaffolding, you would always get flakes of yellow paint and rust marks from the scaffolding on your clothes or on your body. And what was very interesting is that there were no such marks or flakes on Roberto Calvi. So possibly he didn't actually climb down the scaffolding to hang himself. There is the possibility that he was raised up to the scaffolding from a boat on the river. From all this evidence, we can ask all sorts of questions. Why a rope and the bricks? One is for hanging, one is for drowning. Where did he get the rope? Police investigations were never able to determine where the rope came from. How did he climb down the scaffolding without getting paint flakes on him? And then there's a very basic question. Why commit suicide in a rather cold, dirty river when you could do it in a nice, comfortable hotel? It has been established that suicides tend to try and make themselves comfortable in their final moments. And then there's a very big question. How did Calvi get from the hotel to the bridge? This is a map of London. His hotel was down in Chelsea, in West London. The bridge, Blackfriars Bridge, is over on the east side by the City of London. There are plenty of bridges down in Chelsea. Why Blackfriars Bridge, and how did he get across the city? Inquiries amongst taxi drivers and bus drivers, nobody had seen him travel across the city that night. All of these questions raised up convinced the second inquest that it was not a nice, simple suicide. It was a much more complex case, and the likelihood was that Roberto Calvi had been murdered, presumably to keep him quiet. Well, establishing that a case is a murder and proving who did the murder are quite different things. And while the questions raised established that it was probably a murder, there was not sufficient evidence to convict anyone of the murder. And when the Italian authorities charged some of Calvi's associates with a murder, those people were acquitted, found not guilty at the subsequent trial. So the question of who killed Roberto Calvi is still an open question.